We can be disciplined, consistent, even respected, and then realize we're building the wrong life. And the scary part is we can do this for years before realizing it, before realizing we've made an idol of discipline. Discipline has its place and is good, but discipline by itself cannot save us when we don't know who we are. And often we find ourselves drifting through life, holding on to discipline, but still empty inside. We've adopted the careers that others have given us. We've adopted their habits and lifestyles. We've adopted their definitions of success without first figuring out who has God called us to be. And without that solid sense of identity, we're optimizing for the wrong life. That discipline is great in that it multiplies the effort that we're already doing. And so the direction that we're going in, discipline helps to multiply that. It helps us to be more efficient in the effort that we're already doing. But it doesn't answer the deeper questions of identity. Who are we? And what is the work that God has called us to do? Who has He called us to be? And so without that discipline, we find ourselves simply going through the motions of life, but disconnected. We have this career, but our heart is not in it. We're not passionate about it. We're in relationships, but we're just going through the motions of those relationships. We've adopted these habits and lifestyles, but it doesn't bring us more joy. It doesn't bring us life. It just leaves us empty and guilty when we miss the mark. We're guilty for not following through on these habits. We're guilty for not following through on these disciplines, but we never stop to consider if these are the disciplines that we need to adopt for our own life. We've simply adopted what others have given us without stopping to think, is this mine? Is this consistent with the man that God has called me to be? We've often not been asked who we are. We've simply been told what to do. And so we have been raised, and the expectation is simply to do. And there's a place for the doing. But before the doing, often we need a sense of identity. Who are we? Who has God called us to be? So that we know how to make our disciplines work for us instead of the other way around. That disciplines are a great servant. They're not a good master. When we know who we are, when we know the work that God has called us to do, then yes, by all means, let's discipline ourselves to be more efficient, more impactful in our work. But without that sense of identity, we find ourselves drifting. Maybe 5, 10 years down the road, maybe at midlife, all of a sudden we wake up and realize that the life we're building is not the life we're meant to live. And so now there's this quiet dissatisfaction, maybe even bitterness and resentment because we've been slaving away all these years with this discipline, but not yet enjoying the feast, not yet enjoying the fullness of life that God has for us, despite our disciplines. This is the elder brother in the prodigal son story who disciplined himself. He was obedient. He labored for years, but was still not able to enjoy what the Father had for him. And often our discipline functions in the same way, that we are very disciplined, but it's disconnected from our heart. It's disconnected from any sense of passion. Discipline by itself, if we don't know that we are true sons of God, that we are able to enjoy life to the full, then discipline by itself leaves us dry and empty. Obedient, but yet still disconnected from the life and joy that God has for us. Identity formation is hard work. Because before we can affirm this is who we are, we often have to say no to this is who we're not. And it's hard, particularly in our generation, particularly in our culture, to say no, that I can't be everything. I'm not everything. I can't adopt all of these identities. That there's a place where I have to say no, that that's not who I am, and that is costly. It's a costly sacrifice to give up all of these identities, to say no, this is who I've been called to be. And so there's a limitation there, and we don't like limitations, but limitation is also freeing. When I know that this is who I am, and I limit myself to that identity, that's not restricting myself, that I can't live my life to the full, but it is putting a boundary that is recognizing my finiteness, that I cannot do everything. And so when I am able to define myself, that actually gives me more freedom to go deeper. And working with many couples, sometimes they struggle in a dating relationship to define their relationship because they don't want to box themselves in or get things too serious too quick. And on one hand, I get that, but there's a place to define the relationship. And you're going to have a hard time moving that relationship forward without a clear definition of this is who we are. But once you define the relationship, yes, it's restricting that you are closing off your options to other dating partners. While you're closing that off and committing to each other, it now gives you more freedom to build on your relationship. You have a stronger foundation to build on who you are because there's a clear sense of our self as a couple now. We're able to define ourselves. And so now we're able to enjoy the fullness of our relationship. The same is true on the individual level. That sometimes because we don't want to define ourselves, we want to keep our options open, we then end up getting nowhere. Once we define ourselves, yes, there's a limit to that definition. But once we define ourselves, that's actually more freeing. It gives us more confidence to move forward rather than less. We have greater clarity and more confidence to take that next step because we have an understanding, a deeper sense of who we are. In our generation of self-help and life hacks, it's easy to focus on discipline and finding habits to improve. But we can't successfully improve our habits without first knowing who we are. We need a solid sense of who we are to make the habits make sense. So that we're optimizing for the right life, so that we're optimizing for the life that God has called us to live and not the wrong life, not for someone else's life. And so to consider maybe your work and career, maybe your definitions of success, or your lifestyle and habits, or you simply discipline yourself in ways that others have given you. And there's nothing wrong with learning from them, but at some point, are you filtering that through the man that God has called you to be? And does this help me to become the man that God has called me to be? Does it help me become the man and do the work that He's called me to do? Or am I simply optimizing for someone else's life? And sometimes that bitterness, sometimes that resistance, sometimes that sense of being unsettled internally is a clue that we've been optimizing for the wrong life, that we're building someone else's life and not the life that God has called us to. And so we must take time to simply recognize who is the man that God has called me to be. So I can then figure out how to optimize for that life, but I first need to spend some time to figure out who has He called me to be? What is the work that He's called me into? Then I have a clear playing field to figure out what disciplines do I need now to adopt to achieve that purpose, to live on purpose for the work that God has called me to do. Many of us don't need more discipline. We need identity. Because if we don't know who we are, discipline simply helps us become someone else and live the wrong life faster.